Good morning. I'm Vali Nasser, the Dean of Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, and it is my honor to welcome you all today to this conference hosted by Johns Hopkins SAIS's China-Africa Research Initiative. The focus of the discussion today is a timely one, one that emphasizes politics, governance, and agency in China's evolving relationship with Africa. China continues to engage soft power globally, especially in the developing world, making the China-Africa relationship more relevant than ever, in particular as we read more about China's new Silk Road strategy, the One Belt, One Road, and therefore its experience in Africa is more germane. As Chinese influence and outward investment and aid in Africa receives wider scrutiny by the international community, it is worth looking at how African nations reconcile Chinese involvement with local political dynamics. And we are fortunate, therefore, to have leading scholars and analysts with us today to closely examine this important topic. I would like to recognize Professor Deborah Brautigam, the director of SAIS China-Africa Research Initiative, as this conference would not be possible without her. Through her scholarship and leadership, she has made SAIS the premier meeting place to investigate the realities of China's evolving global reach. Her research has also advanced the interdisciplinary focus of the school as it brings together the fields of China, Africa, and development studies. I would also like to thank the tireless staff of the International Development Program at SAIS for their continued hard work, creativity, and commitment to making this conference a reality. Thank you again. Please enjoy the program today, and let me now turn the floor to Professor Brautigam. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Nasser, for launching our 4th annual China-Africa Research Initiative Conference. Marie tells me I'm supposed to tell you that our Twitter hashtag is, it's hashtag CARI, C-A-R-I 2018, CARI 2018. All right, is that right, Marie? Okay, so thank you to you, Marie, for being the organizational genius behind this and everything else we do at CARI. And thank you to Dean Peter Lewis, Yoonjung Park, Tanvi Nagpal, Ada Ho, Jijung Huang, Cinnamon Dornsife, and Nicole Kazi, and all of our student helpers. Your support is so appreciated. To the Carnegie Corporation of New York, which funded this conference, thank you as well. That was a pretty major contribution. And welcome to all our panelists and chairs whose lengthy journeys have brought you here today from at least 13 countries around the world. And welcome to our audience. It's now been 4 years since we started the China-Africa Research Initiative. And our mission was to promote research, conduct evidence-based analysis, foster collaboration, and train future leaders. And when I look around this room at all of you, I can see how times have changed in our field. In 1983, when I started my PhD dissertation work on Chinese engagement in Africa, there were about 4 people interested in this topic. And one of them was George Yu, who still lives in Berkeley, and he's quite old and wonderful. And 2 of them were my parents. At least they told me they thought my dissertation was quite interesting. I'd like to say I never doubted that the China-Africa field would grow and grow and grow, but that would be fake news. This is kind of surprising from the perspective of 36 years. And even though today we're competing with the World Bank's annual meetings and other events all around Washington, and rain, you came here. And you came here, I think, because the timing has never been, as the dean suggested, more right for a conference on China, Africa, and the topic of politics. So there's no better place to hold a conference like this than SAIS, if I may do a little bit of marketing for us. We have exceptionally strong programs in China studies, African studies, energy, resources and environment, international development, international political economy, strategic studies. And they're all relevant for what we do at CARI, and we collaborate across the different programs. And they frame what we will discover over these 2 days. Our first panel is on China, Africa, and the West. It's a good place to start in our quest for knowledge, deeper knowledge of this important subject. And so let me take us deeper into history first. In 1897, the world was introduced to the idea of the yellow peril. And I quote from the great scholar Wikipedia. The yellow peril, also yellow terror and yellow specter, is a racist color metaphor that is integral to the xenophobic theory of colonialism, that the peoples of East Asia are a danger to the Western world. The yellow peril metaphor took concrete form in many ways, but one was in the fictional villain, Dr. Fu Manchu. And one of the books about Dr. Fu Manchu has the subtitle, The Chinese Devil Man Who Wanted to Rule the World. As Cambridge University researcher Emma Maudsley reminded us 10 years ago in her insightful article on media representations of China in Africa and Britain in Africa. The article is called Fu Manchu versus Dr. Livingstone in the Dark Continent, ? And everything in those quote marks. The concerns over China's role in Africa have deep roots. What a difference a decade makes, right? When Emma wrote her stunningly good article, the West was concerned about China taking over Africa. We're apparently still concerned about that, but now we are increasingly concerned about China taking over the world. The Fu Manchu books were written between 1913 and 1959 by Sax Rohmer, a man who had no prior knowledge of China or Chinese culture. Apparently, he asked a Ouija board for clues to making money, and it spelled out Chinaman, Chinaman. And so he went forward and wrote his books. And in Washington today, assumptions about African countries also seem at times to be uttered by a man who is interested in making money and has no little knowledge of Africa. And perhaps no knowledge at all. Our president's top China advisor is a man who has written at least 3 books about China, including a polemic called Death by China. Like the author of the Dr. Fu Manchu books, he also had little prior knowledge of China. And these books, as the former head of the American Chamber of Commerce in China put it, are full of hyperbole, inaccuracies, and a cartoonish caricature of China. Let's hope these two are not also using Ouija boards to formulate policies, to steer the ship of state. But it's not only in Washington that we see the appearance of significant knowledge deficits. In China, the knowledge about Africa is far, far lower than it is in the US. And cartoonish caricatures of Africa are far from uncommon. In Beijing several months ago, as most of you know, a major government-sponsored event featured a skit with a skinny Chinese actress playing a plump African mama in blackface. Beijing was clearly surprised when Africans were offended, and they are continually surprised when their assumptions about Africa are contradicted by realities. I vividly remember a Chinese agricultural aid worker I interviewed in Freetown. He was thinking about investing in farming in Sierra Leone. All this land, he said as he gestured to the green hills around Freetown. No one lives here. Surprise, there are lots of people living in that green land. And every bit of that land already has multiple claimants. And as I recounted in my last book, he was far from the only would-be Chinese investor to make that mistake. And to complete the knowledge deficit circle, we can turn to Africa. As our CARI Chinese loan research team has found, a number of African governments have been overeating at the Chinese loan table, just as they overate at the West loan table in decades past. Some are already experiencing the indigestion that comes from having to pay for their meals. Many view China as the next hand coming to feed them, rather than an incredibly useful source of ideas about how development can be kickstarted. So as you can see, there's a lot of work for us here in the China-Africa field. That's been a lot of grim news, but the good news is we academics can help. Politics is a study of who gets what, when, and how. It's the study of power. And in the China-Africa relations field, we have been deeply concerned with this. Who gets what, when, and how. And with power. Just last month, during the Tillerson trip to Africa, Washington was also deeply, if very briefly, for about 15 minutes, concerned with China and Africa and with these questions. And I have to admit, it's not often that our conferences come right into a news cycle like that. And I think maybe Marie was consulting the Ouija board when she scheduled this. But there are serious issues at stake here. The world is wondering, what does a new naval outpost in Djibouti mean? China's first in the world. What does this mean? Is China going to use force to protect its interests in Africa? African civil societies are wondering if President Xi Jinping's lifting of term limits means that their own authoritarian leaders are going to stay in power longer. And more Africans are wondering how they can hitch a ride on China's rising star and what that might mean for their security and their development and their identities. We have over 30 presenters in chairs here today. They come from a dozen countries and nearly as many disciplines. That diversity always makes things more interesting. They've asked questions about military force and predatory loans and the dance of foreign aid. They've examined local politics and the roots of anti-Chinese populism. They've researched capacity building and corruption. I can't wait to hear them, and I'm sure you can't either. So let's begin. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is David Shen, and I'm going to serve as a moderator for the first panel this morning. We will have the panelists speak in the order in which they appear on the program. They have all assured me that they will hold to the 15-minute rule, and if they don't, I will try to intervene and keep them at 16 minutes. So we will try to keep the Q&A session to be as long as possible, as I think that is normally the most useful part of these kinds of conferences. Let me just say a word or two about the topic for the opening panel session. I think as I look back on my own experience with the China-Africa relationship, and particularly the role of the United States and the West in that relationship, I've long been a proponent of trying to maximize the ability of the West and China to cooperate in Africa for the mutual advantage of Africans. I must say I was probably more optimistic about these prospects when I started my own efforts to research China-Africa some 10, 12 years ago than I am today. I think that developments in both China and particularly the United States, to some extent in Africa, have caused me to be somewhat more pessimistic about the prospects of collaboration, cooperation, as opposed to competition. And that's unfortunate. I think there still are some areas where there has been cooperation and it will continue to hold. UN peacekeeping is a case in point. Countering piracy in the Gulf of Aden is another case, and there are other possibilities. But an awful lot has been said and done in the last couple of years, particularly, to raise serious questions in my mind about the ability of collaboration and cooperation. And hopefully we will unpack a few of these themes or concerns in the first panel session this morning. And if we don't, please feel free to raise them in the Q&A portion of this panel. The concerns, I think, emanate from China's increasingly important global role, not just the new facility in Djibouti, but clearly an emphasis on naval power around the Indian Ocean area and even further. They have a relationship to the new administration in Washington with some tougher language coming out of that administration, and as a result raise some serious questions about where this whole issue of cooperation can take root, which, as I say, I still hope is the case as we move forward. But let me open this up now to the various panelists, and as I say, we're going to take this in order, starting with Christine Ha Kodesh, who is from the German Development Institute. You have a short biography in your program, so I'm not going to read that. Among other things, her research focuses on China's engagement in Africa. And I believe Christine's going to use the podium, so please, Christine, the floor is yours.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. First of all, many thanks, Deborah and CARI, for having me here and for giving me the opportunity to present and discuss some of my work with a very distinguished expert audience, so it's a great pleasure. What I'm going to speak about is my new book, which is going to be published within the next few days, hopefully, and it will be available open access, so in case you're interested, you can also just click on the website. As I said, hopefully within the next few days. So when we discuss about China-Africa relations, one topic that often comes up in discussions and is particularly controversially debated is the question of what are the implications of China's engagement in Africa for political reforms in Africa and for the EU's and other Western actors' attempts at supporting governance, democracy, and human rights. So this is also nicely captured here in this little cartoon. But even though this is a topic that pops up sooner or later in almost any debate on China-Africa relations, it's also a topic where we still have very little knowledge. We know very little on what are actually the effects of China for political reforms, if any, and what are the implications for Western democracy and governance support. So what I try to do in the book is to present an analytical framework to address a specific aspect within this broader question, and then to look into case studies and conduct comparative case study analysis to see what we actually find when we look into the empirics. My research starts with an empirical observation. When the European Union aims at supporting governance reforms in African countries through governance instruments, political dialogue, governance aid, political conditionality, the EU can only do this if there is at least some level of cooperation and a little bit of willingness from African governments to engage with the EU. So you cannot think of governance aid to be implemented without any kind of cooperation from the African side. But then when we look at 3 African countries and see how this plays out, we see a great diversity. So Angola, Ethiopia, and Rwanda since the early 2000s until 2014 have been willing to a very different extent to engage with the EU in the implementation of governance instruments. Angola was quite active and increasingly proactive. Ethiopia has been relatively reluctant with some changes over time. And Angola has been reluctant to engage in the early 2000s, but then increasingly ignored EU attempts of fostering cooperation on governance reforms. And these differences cannot easily be explained when we look at the existing literature. So all 3 countries are authoritarian, party-based authoritarian regimes. All 3 have similarly low levels of political liberalization. Their dependence on the EU differs, but this would not easily explain the difference we see here between Ethiopia and Rwanda. And China has become a cooperation partner for all 3 since the mid-2000s, but can also not easily explain the differences we see over time. So what I'm interested in is then two research questions. First, what explains these differences, and then whether China's presence has any effect. So does China make it more difficult for the EU to establish cooperation with African governments on governance reforms? So my key interest is African governments' strategies, because I believe that it's very important to look at the motives, interests, and African governments' strategies if we want to gain a better understanding of why the EU's good governance support in the end does or does not lead to its intended outcome. So the focus is very much on understanding African governments' strategies towards the EU and China. And for analytical purposes, I then make a few simple assumptions. So I assume that African governments make a few cost-benefit analysis when they decide whether they engage with the EU on governance reforms or not. And then there are 4 factors that influence these cost-benefit calculations. First of all, African governments take a close look at what the EU offers in terms of governance support. So does the EU seek at supporting the effectiveness of government institutions or the democratic quality of decision-making processes? Does the EU seek to empower civil society opposition actors, or does it mainly engage with the government? And that makes a difference, obviously, for African governments. And then they assess how costly or beneficial this offer for cooperation is in light of their own survival strategies. So how costly or how difficult is it for African governments what the EU offers in terms of cooperation for their own strategies of staying in power? And if this cooperation is costly, African governments then might take other aspects of the EU's cooperation into account. So does the EU offer attractive trade packages, financial foreign direct investment, aid packages? How attractive is the EU's overall cooperation with them? And then finally, is there alternative cooperation partners? So does China or others present an alternative offer for cooperation? And China is certainly the most interesting and relevant here. So what I then do is that I look into country cases. So I analyze the EU's and China's engagement with Angola, Ethiopia, and Rwanda between the period 2000 and 2014. And I built a lot of primary data for that, so a lot of interviews, press analysis, etc. And I would actually not like to talk you through the case studies because there's little time, but instead I would like to highlight 3 sets of findings that emerge from this research, and then you can go to the book if you're interested more in the case studies. So the first set of factors or findings that is, in my view, interesting relates to the domestic politics. So I clearly find that domestic politics matter a lot when we want to understand of why African governments engage with the EU on governance reforms. So I argue that authoritarian domestic politics can be conceived as a kind of political game between the government and political opponents. And in order to prevent political opposition or respond to political oppositions, African governments then have different types of survival strategies at hand that they can use. And depending how they are challenged and depending on the survival strategies that they use, cooperation with the EU becomes more or less costly. So just to briefly illustrate this to make it a bit more concrete. What I find in the case of Rwanda for the period between 2008 and 2012 is that the government had a strong focus on building effective state institutions, on supporting public goods provision, poverty reduction. The government had very little to no problem to win elections because it was not challenged from the domestic opposition. And in this context, the European Union has used a strategy that focused exactly on supporting the effectiveness of government institutions and on promoting or supporting elections. And the EU has not tried to empower civil society organization, improving civil rights or political liberties, which would have been much more costly for the government. So actually, the EU strategy in this period, in the case of Rwanda, largely aligned with the government's own strategies and thereby produced little cost, but rather benefits for the government. If we look at another example, the case of Angola between 2006 and 2012, for instance, we see that the government has invested relatively little in supporting the effectiveness of state institutions, but rather used state institutions as measures of co-optation. The EU also used a relatively narrow approach that focused on the effectiveness of government institutions, fight against corruption, public financial management, but because of the different strategy of the Angolan government, it has been actually much more costly for the Angolan government to engage, and we don't see any type of, or we see very little engagement and cooperation from the Angolan government side. So my work shows that this domestic political game between the government and the opposition, and this explains not only the survival strategies that governments choose, but also shows whether, how open governments are to actually engaging with the EU on governance reforms. Then there is the question, second set of results relates to the presence of China. So first of all, my research shows that China indeed has become a cooperation partner, an alternative cooperation partner for countries like Ethiopia and Angola since the mid-2000s. China has also become more important for Rwanda, but has relatively similar strategies to the EU, so also engages mainly as a donor with Rwanda. And So China obviously has become more relevant and an alternative cooperation partner. But more importantly, what I can show is that even though China has become an alternative cooperation partner in the case of Ethiopia and Angola, this had relatively little effect on these countries' willingness to engage with the EU on governance reforms. So for all three cases, what I do is that I look at the specific period in time when China becomes more important, and then I trace whether cooperation strategies of the African government change, and I see whether this can be attributed to the presence of China. And I also ask counterfactual questions. So would we expect that these governments would cooperate with the EU in any different way if China was not present as an actor? And so I find that there is relatively little relevance of China. And I will not go in the case studies, but just present Ethiopia as a crucial case here. Because in the case of Ethiopia, all factors are present that we would expect that China actually makes a difference for the EU's engagement with the country. So during the election crisis in 2005, the Ethiopian government was severely challenged from the domestic opposition. Ethiopia was dependent on the EU and others. China was present, so very shortly after the election crisis, early 2006, the first loan was extended. So what we would have expected that in the aftermath, Ethiopia doesn't stops engaging with the EU. We see that there have been challenges, but in the medium term, Ethiopia has continued to reluctantly engage and actually engaged more openly than, for instance, Angola. So what I would argue is that China's presence can indeed ease pressure from Western actors. It can be a very important partner at crucial moments in time for African governments, but it does not per se undermine the EU's governance support instruments. And its effect is very much contingent, similar to the European Union, on domestic politics in African countries. And then the third very brief finding relating to China actually relates to a factor that is very much overlooked in China's relations with Africa, which is the relevance of the CCP's engagement with African political parties. So what I found very interesting when doing my research comparing the EU's and China's strategies with African countries is that while the EU mainly engages with the government and to some extent civil society, China has an additional channel for cooperation, which is the CCP's engagement with the ruling party, which obviously is a key actor in party-based regimes. China has very long-standing, the CCP has long-standing ties with African parties, but since the early 2000s has reinforced cooperation. And what I can show is that the intensity of this cooperation varies quite considerably across parties. So for the EPRDF is one of the top 5 cooperation partners in Africa, whereas the MPLA in Angola has very limited engagement. Rwanda Patriotic Front is more in the medium range of cooperation. So there's obviously the question of what are the drivers and effects. There was no place left in the book to discuss this, but this is part of my research now. And then thirdly and finally, the third set of factors or findings that I found interesting relates to the EU's good governance support. First, I observed that the EU actually is not very strategic in applying its good governance strategies. So the EU, in a way, fails to take into account this domestic game in authoritarian regimes. And in particular, the EU fails to use opportunities when authoritarian governments are not very much challenged from the opposition, and when more soft instruments like political dialogue, governance aid could have an influence, the EU is not very strategic in applying these instruments in this specific moment. And a case would be Rwanda, but maybe to some extent also Angola. Then secondly, what I found interesting is that there seems to be some kind of mismatch. So we have a lot of research and discussion on situations on exceptional situations, like the political crisis in Ethiopia in 2005, where the government is severely challenged and where the EU uses sanctions, negative conditionality. But this is also the moment where the EU's instruments actually can make relatively little difference. So I think it would be very important to focus more on these periods of relative domestic stability when soft instruments can take an effect, to see how the EU can contribute to governance reforms in the medium to longer term. And then finally, when we look at the EU's engagement and governance support through the lens of domestic politics of authoritarian regimes, we see that there are quite a bit of unintended negative consequences that can emerge from the EU's engagement, which we have seen, for instance, in the case of Rwanda. So the EU can even contribute to stabilizing authoritarian structures, and I think it would be interesting to have more research and more work going in this direction. So one final sentence. What do we take now from this? China clearly is a very important actor. I'm not saying that China is irrelevant for the EU's governance support in Africa, but what comes out of my research is that before pointing at China, it would be really important for the EU to increase the coherency and consistency of its own policies, and to make more effort in better understanding the domestic dynamics in authoritarian regimes. And so we have a situation now where the EU's governance support is severely challenged with the migration crisis that we have, and the EU's shift in strategies due to the migration crisis. But I would say that the EU should not give up on this governance support agenda for various reasons, but instead make efforts to act more strategically. Thank you.
Please thank me in joining us. And I thank Christine also for staying on time. The next presentation is by Haley Swedlund, and Haley is at the Center for International Conflict Analysis and Management in the Netherlands. Her research has been particularly on international political economy, development, and conflict studies. Haley, the floor is yours.
All right, well, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. I'm very happy to be with you all today, and I'm looking forward to the conversations that we'll have over the next day and a half. I think my presentation follows very nicely on the previous one, in that I, in my work, have really been interested in exploring the dynamics and the relationships between traditional donors and recipient countries, specifically in Africa. And so what I'd like to do today is think about, and when I say traditional donors, I should emphasize that I'm talking about members of the OECD DAC, the Development Assistance Committee. And so it's from this research that I've been interested in exploring in what ways China might be changing the way traditional donors work with African governments, and the way in which China negotiates may differ from traditional donors. And so what I'd like to do today is say a little bit more about the larger project in which I come at these issues before delving into why I'm skeptical in a similar way, I think, as the previous presentation, about this broad narrative that China is dramatically changing the way traditional donors operate in Africa. And then I'll talk a little bit about the spaces where I do think things are changing. And I want to close by saying and reflecting a little bit on some of the spaces where I think we could have more research, which I think there are plenty of opportunities, but I guess I'll use my last minute to give a plug for a couple of things that I think are particularly interesting. So last year, I published a book with Cornell University Press entitled The Development Dance: How Donors and Recipients Negotiate the Delivery of Foreign Aid. And in the book, I attempt to do two things. So first, I provide a theoretical framework for understanding how donor agencies, and again, I'm talking about traditional donor agencies, and recipient governments negotiate the delivery of aid. And second, I explain why the negotiated compromises that are reached between donors and recipient governments are rarely sustainable over the long term. So here I'm wanting to explore why we see so many fads and fashions within development cooperation. And the book is based on over 150 interviews that I conducted with high-level donor officials and also with recipient country officials. So these are heads of national banks, individuals working for the Ministry of Finance, permanent secretaries, ambassadors on the donor side, as well as senior aid staff. As it's also based on a survey I carried out with donor officials working in 20 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And what I argue in the book that donor agencies and recipient governments are always engaging in aid policy bargaining, and that's what I mean by the development dance. However, a large challenge for these negotiations is that donors and recipients have difficulties making credible commitments to one another. So on the recipient side, domestic political interest often trump donor requests, and aid is largely fungible. And on the on the donor side, the priorities of donor countries can change quickly, and donor agencies often have an incentive to move the goalpost on recipients. And what I explain in the book is that this very ubiquitous feature, which in development assistance is actually much more consequential than it may seem at first. So not only does it help us to explain why certain ways of delivering aid are taken up to begin with, it also, and most importantly, helps us to explain why we see so many fads and fashions in development cooperation. So donors and recipients negotiate aid policy compromises in order to deliver aid. However, because both sides have trouble keeping their commitments to one another, these compromises break down and have to be continually renegotiated. And this means that if we want to know whether or not a particular way of delivering aid is likely to be sustainable over the long term, we can't just look at whether or not it's effective. We also have to look at whether or not it induces credible commitments from both sides. So you might imagine, so as I was talking to during this project, so I conducted these interviews and I did the survey. In the context of this research, China kept coming up over and over again in my conversations, often even unprompted by me. I began to think a little bit more about, okay, so I'm developing this framework on negotiation, but how might China change these dynamics, right? So how might the fact that we have a growing role of China in the countries where I was working change this? And so this is what I began to explore probably about a year or two into the project, and I talk about it in the last chapter of the book, but then I also published an article last year in International Affairs in which I try to address the following research question. So is China eroding the bargaining power of traditional donors? So are we seeing a shift in the influence of traditional OECD DAC donors because of China? And what I do in the article is I express skepticism about the fact that we're seeing such a dramatic shift. So there's often a narrative that because China, and I think it also goes to some of the discussions that Deborah was saying in her opening remarks, because there's a lot of fear about the role of China and what it's doing, there's a narrative that China's presence and its growing presence in Africa is dramatically kind of changing things, and that as a response, traditional donors are changing the way they operate within Africa. And I actually didn't find a lot of evidence for this. So that doesn't mean I don't think that what China is doing is really important and we should investigate it, but rather I'm skeptical of the fact that it has triggered traditional donors to behave in certain ways. And so I want to talk a little bit about why I have that skepticism. So I mentioned that I carried out a survey, and this survey targeted heads of development corporations. So these are individuals that are running donor missions abroad. If you're familiar with the U.S. aid or structure, this would be the country director. So it's the individual that's running the mission abroad. And I simply asked them, and this survey was carried out, the questions about China were asked in 15 countries. And I asked, is China changing the bargaining power your agency has within Tanzania or within Uganda or within whatever country they were working? And somewhat surprising to me, I found that the largest percentage of them said no. So 47% said no. A good percentage said that they weren't sure, and I think that that's important because I think it also suggests that there's a lot of uncertainty about what's happening. But to me, it doesn't jive with this idea that somehow China's presence is dramatically changing the way traditional donors operate. It may be, of course, however, that this is a fairly high threshold, and that when I'm asking about bargaining power, maybe China is changing the way development cooperation occurs in other areas. So I also asked about, I'm not sure exactly how. Oops, I lost it. Well, I think I'm not sure. I'll go on and just tell you a little bit about it, and hopefully the PowerPoint will come on in just a minute. So I also asked about the impact of China in four different scenarios. So on aid negotiations, on the drafting of their country strategies, on decisions about future aid allocations, and on decisions about development cooperation in the extractive or natural resource sector. Yeah, this is perfect. And what I found here is consistent with the previous questions, in that the mean values for all the different scenarios were around a 3 on a scale of 10, right? So in which 0 represented not a consideration and 10 represented a major consideration. So on average, the individuals that I surveyed, and we can talk certainly more about how this is, it's a small sample, and we have to continue to investigate this question, but at least of those that I sampled, there's not a big indication that somehow it's changing their behavior across these four scenarios. There is, I think, some evidence to suggest that amongst multilaterals, or those working for multilateral agencies, that there's more influence. But for me, the results from the survey suggest that the majority of officials surveyed do not see China as a direct threat to their respective agencies' bargaining power, nor do they perceive Chinese aid and investments as fundamentally changing how they operate. So then what I do in the paper is I think a little bit about, okay, well, how might we understand this data? So is it that China's impact is simply overstated, or is it that donor officials are simply unaware or unwilling to take into account the growing role of Africa? And similar to Christine, I won't go into the details of the case studies. So in the paper, I talk about 3 cases. I talk about Uganda, Ghana, and Tanzania. And I think these are all cases that we're going to talk about in much more detail over the next day and a half. But I just wanted to highlight 4 important things from the case studies. The first 2, I think, are things that Deborah's work has shown for a very long time, but I think they're worth reiterating. It's important to keep in mind that in none of these countries is China's presence new, right? They've been there, of course, it's been growing, but this engagement is not something that has just started, and sometimes the way it's depicted. Figures on Chinese aid are often prone to exaggeration. We're basing them on media reports often. What this means in practice is that sometimes it's exaggerated what's actually occurring, not only necessarily in terms of the dollar amounts, but also in terms of the scope of the activities. The last 2 I want to say a little bit more about, because I think it's specifically important when we're talking about development cooperation. And what happens, I think, if you look into what China is actually doing when it comes to development assistance, is that it simply looks very different from what traditional donors are doing. So Chinese official finance goes almost exclusively to state-owned Chinese companies. On the other hand, traditional development assistance is primarily going through recipient governments. So you're either going through national treasuries, or you're working with local NGOs in collaboration with ministries. At the same time, China's engagement has mainly been in the productive sectors, so in infrastructure, agriculture, and mining, where traditional donors have, particularly over the years of the Millennium Development Goals, have focused on the social sector. So they focused on health and education. And why this matters is that if I'm an African government official, I'm not seeing those 2 in direct competition. I'm wanting to have both of them, right? I'm courting both traditional assistance from China, and I'm courting traditional assistance from traditional donors. And so we don't see this competition that is sometimes, I think, often stated. And this I go through kind of in the paper in more details how this plays out. Now I want to backtrack a little bit and say a couple of caveats to that statement, in that when China and traditional donors do directly compete, so for example on infrastructure projects, many recipient governments do prefer assistance from China. And to understand this argument, I think it's important to go back to some of the arguments, or the discussion I was making about credible commitments in the beginning. So from my interviews with African government officials, what was often told to me is that if there is a competition, so let's say the World Bank and China are both interested in building a dam, that often the preference is for Chinese assistance, because the idea is that Chinese assistance will be quicker to materialize and will actually come about. Now, this is, I think it's important to emphasize, this is much more than a story about that there's fewer conditionalities with Chinese assistance. It's a story also about the way the product is, the procurement process. It's a story about the fact that if you are the World Bank and you're building a dam, there's often multiple collaborators. There's often multiple different decision points in which aid is allocated, where the perception amongst many recipient government officials is that it's simply quicker when it comes to China. I say perceptions because I think that this is an empirical question, so I think we actually need to investigate whether or not that's true. I'm only wanting to report that this is kind of what the perception, what I'm getting from these interviews. But this matters when it comes to thinking about questions around credible commitments, because there definitely is the sense that China is better at making these credible commitments. I was frequently told over and over, if you want a road and you want it, a road is promised in 2012. If you get the Germans to build it, it will come about in 5 to 6 years. If you get the Chinese to build it, it will come about in 2 years. Again, we have to investigate whether or not that's actually true, but that's certainly the perception. The second is that the presence of China may not be a cause of the declining bargaining power of traditional donors in some African countries, but it may be a symptom. And I think here a good example is the case of Ghana. In this chart, so the blue lines simply look at foreign direct investment from 2000 to 2013, where the yellow line, or excuse me, the orange line looks at ODA as a share of GNI over the same period. And all I want to illustrate with this is that China is generally interested in investing in countries where you have growing economies, where you have FDI that's an increasing part of the economy. In the case of Ghana, FDI from China is an important part, but it's certainly not the majority of this investment. And in those specific contexts, of course, ODA is declining as a percentage of the national income. And what this means is that in the countries where China is active, we may be seeing a declining influence of traditional donors because they simply are not contributing as much to the national economies. But that doesn't mean it's directly caused by China. So here we may have a correlation, but we don't necessarily have a causation. The last just couple of things I want to say is, I think it's, of course, important to think about how this may change over time. So particularly the survey, the survey was carried out in 2014. Things move quickly. Things are changing, right? Chinese investment is increasing. So I think it's important to continue to reevaluate this over time. I think it's also interesting to think about in potentially beyond these big narratives about how China is dramatically changing it, to think about, well, has China changed, for example, the way traditional donors engage in particular sectors? So we see increasingly that traditional donors seem to be more interested in the productive sectors. So to some degree, has China's presence pushed donors to engage more heavily in those sectors? I also think it's important to systematically think a little bit more about the views of recipient government. So the survey was carried out with donor officials for pragmatic reasons. And of course, in my interviews, I spoke to a lot of recipient government officials, but I think it would be really great and important if we can have a more systematic survey across different countries, also to see variation. We talk about Africa as a very, in Chinese engagement in Africa and a very broad scope, but I think all of us in the room know that the engagement really varies across different countries, and so I would like to see that also more represented and the views of recipient governments. The last point would be in terms of trilateral cooperation. So I think we're increasingly seeing trilateral cooperation, for example, between Japan and the UK, or with different governments, and I think there's a lot more to investigate here. And I just wanted to finally say that this question of credible commitments, I think, is also important to come back, right? So I would like to think more clearly in the future. So is it that China is actually able to make more credible commitments? And if so, why? Is it something about domestic politics? Is it something about the aid structure? And that, for me, is something that is an open question and certainly worth investigating more. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Haley. Tara Mock is the next panelist, and Tara is at Michigan State University. She has recently completed her dissertation, which explores cultural identity and community formation through the lens of Chinese nation branding in Africa. Tara, the floor is yours.
Okay. All right. Okay. So, good morning. Today, I'll be exploring modern Afro-Chinese relations through the lens of Chinese nation branding in Africa. The presentation is derived from my larger dissertation project, which examines how state manufacture of Africa-China as an identity construction influences creation of a fictive Afro-Chinese community. So I'm arguing that the Chinese state, and by extension, state-owned and state-supported enterprises, invoke what I am terming brand China to create a national imaginary largely predicated on feelings of fictive kinship, sameness, or similitude with Africa, prompting a reimagined community inclusive of the Chinese. I further argue that such reimaginings, reconstructions, and expansions, and their influence on individual concepts of self and other are particularly vital within the globalized realities of our modern world as nation states once again reconceptualize their mandates in pursuit of global capital. So when the Hubei Provincial Museum in, sorry, my video isn't playing there, in Wuhan, China, opened its exhibit, This is Africa, on September 28, 2017, no one anticipated the protests that it would incite. The exhibit featured a series of diptychs, each containing a photo of an African person juxtaposed alongside a wild animal, in what the photographer maintained was designed to celebrate harmony between man and nature. Photos of African people expressing various states of emotion alongside a cautious cheetah, curious meerkats, contemplative baboon, proboscis, lemur, and colobus monkeys sparked accusations of racism from observers outside and within China. Neither the photographer nor the museum's curator acknowledged the casual racism, yet the exhibit, which opened to fanfare surrounding China's 8-day National Day holiday, was unceremoniously shuttered fewer than 2 weeks later. From an historical perspective, equating African people with animals would be problematic as an isolated event. Early literary, cinematic, and photographic forms of entertainment during the late 19th and early 20th centuries often depicted African people as savage and animalistic in binary opposition to Europeans who were deemed more civilized and advanced. The perception that they are not like us, are subhuman, need our protection and guidance was an important rationale for colonialism and served to cement community identity amongst Europeans and bolster support for the colonial project. Similarly to the cinematic and literary projection of empire accompanying the colonial project, within neoliberal globalization, governments continue to search for ways to reconstitute images of self against that of the political other. All right. Okay. And national imaginary constructions accompanying the contemporary project of global capital accumulation continue to include filmic, journalistic, and literary manifestations of political and social rhetoric of alterity, developed during colonialism. Within the US and Europe, and more importantly for this analysis, throughout Asia, the practice persists in everything from the sales of cigarettes in Korea to washing powder in China, leaving one to wonder whether This is Africa is representative of an isolated incident or more endemic of widely held societal views. So within an increasingly encompassing relations that mark globalization, identities like goods and services are facilitated along new routes of circulation and expansion. Cultural identities, in particular, companion to other forms of identity, continue to be imbued with the forms of power relations and inequalities reminiscent of these earlier eras of capital accumulation. And nowhere is this point more profoundly observed than Africa, where the landscape has changed rapidly within the last 20 years, shifting from solidly Western-led to one in which new developmental partners from the global South are taking on more pivotal roles. These changing dynamics have led to increased competition between Beijing, Washington, and London for favor with African nationals, a competition often played out similarly to the colonial project in the court of public opinion. Within this competition, the PRC increasingly manufactures an imaginary of itself underpinned by cultural and historical proximity between the two regions, This helps to distinguish it from other brands, diminish the effects of competing negative brand images, and facilitate easier access to goods, markets, and resources on the continent. So my research examines the tension between national imaginary constructions necessitated by the proliferation of global capital, extant colonial discourse, and the repackaging of cultural identities to increase state attractiveness through the lens of Chinese nation branding. So the question that I'm asking today is how the Chinese state constructs a national imaginary of Africa-China in its promotional discourse. How does the PRC inculcate images of difference from the West and similitude with Africa through its brand? How does the Chinese state use nation branding to align its historical experience as a community with Africa's distinct socio-historical markers? The question historicizes the functional use of nation branding within Afro-Chinese relations, and in doing so, it pays particular attention to how the relationship continues to reinforce and reimagine the narrative of the Bandung Conference, colonialism, neo-imperialism, and globalization. So the project has been guided by scholars of both Africana studies, which is my home field, and political science, which includes Peter Van Ham's scholarship on the rise of the brand state, wherein he identified a shift in political paradigms whereby the modern world of geopolitics and power is slowly being replaced by the postmodern world of images and messages. The project has been equally influenced by Benedict Anderson's scholarship on imagined communities and Ruth Sims Hamilton's suppositions that the injustices visited upon the African continent are a world phenomenon that creates opportunities for new conceptualizations of community and identity to form. So in order to explore this aspect of the project, I used a number of visual and textual artifacts that were fashioned by the Chinese state and state-owned or state-supported enterprises as the principal heuristic vehicle. Specifically, I engaged in a critical discourse analysis, which examines how social and cultural perspectives and identities are constructed semiotically through language. I analyzed speeches, magazine covers, editorials, and advertisements to include artifacts available for both elite and popular consumption. These included 337 items, 260 textual, 77 visual artifacts. And this aspect of the project worked in conversation with 13 months of field research in the Gambia, Kenya, and South Africa, where I collected more than 4,000 local responses to the phenomenon. So what did I find? So the analysis yielded 88 unique notes covering topics like benevolence, history, poverty, security, mutual benefit. And these notes were grouped into 7 distinct thematic categories encompassing issues of development, sovereignty, marginalization, friendship, sameness, partnership, and a miscellany of other references. Most frequent references were to notes surrounding themes of sameness, development, model, friendship, and partnership. And the findings for each were complex and nuanced and manifold, so I won't have time to go over all of them, but I do want to spend some time talking about sameness, which emerged as the most frequently used concept. So the most frequently constructed narrative of brand China is one of sameness. Sameness creates a discursive framework for establishing points of commonality between Chinese and African people, the historical and contemporary experiences of Chinese and African people, cultural propinquity, being part of a shared or the same community, kinship, brotherhood, sisterhood, or familyhood with Africa. The ideology of brotherhood in particular is reinforced through 251 of the 337 artifacts. Throughout Chinese artifacts, African people are regarded as our brothers and sisters. As an example, when remarking on China's seat being restored in the UN, Xi Jinping remarked, "Our brothers and sisters burst into tears of happiness. Therefore, we can by no means fail our African brothers." Sameness is also constructed through the use of historical reference points to illustrate experiential similarities. A speech by Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi in 2015 encapsulates this point. He remarked that there is a popular Chinese song named Hold Your Hands. The lyrics go like this: "Because I have traveled the path you have traveled and suffered the pain you have suffered, I share your joy in pursuit." I think it can be borrowed to describe the relations between China and Africa. Chinese and African people have suffered from similar scourge, and both have traveled a path fraught with hardship. This is why we're able to understand each other, share weal and woe, and join hands in pursuing the same goal and same dream. Cultural proximity creates an additional layer of support for Afro-Chinese similitude, and it's often reinforced through the use of proverbs, such as this quote, an African proverb which states that the one who asks questions doesn't lose his way, while Chinese people believe that one has to be not ashamed of to ask and learn from his inferiors to become a real master. Many similar values exist in both Chinese and African cultures. Such imagery bespeaks an attempt to establish a cultural connection between African and Chinese people, demonstrating the intentionality of a socially constructed Chinese imaginary. Finally, the concept of shared marginalization by the West is also discursively constructed within Brand China as a component of sameness. Dr. Liu Shenfa, Chinese ambassador to Kenya, remarked that China and Africa are united through the mutual experiences by both as victims of Western colonialism and oppression. In a separate speech, Liu again states that in modern times, both as victims of Western colonialism and aggression, Chinese and African people have encouraged and supported each other to achieve national liberation and independence. Such statements reinforce the fact that despite changes to its developmental trajectory, the PRC continues to instill a consistent image of self mirroring the socio-historical African experience. So what does any of this mean for Africa, for China, for Africana studies, and the remainder of my research project? Well, Beijing successfully curates an image of self on the continent as a counter-hegemonic force against Western tyranny, privileging themes of oppression, domination, and subordination symbolic of the global African experience. Similarly to the mission of the colonial project, the overarching imperative is to construct a national imaginary predicated upon a binary opposition between we and them remains constant. In this instance, however, the we are Africa and China, and the them is the West, as identity maps are being redrawn such that something patently foreign and distant acquires, for one reason or another, a semblance of similarity or sameness. This process of cultural synchronization, whereby the tendency is toward convergence and homogeneity, is unprecedented historically and attributed to the spread of global capital. These practices of national imaginary construction are important because they're routine, they're so prevalent, they are popular, and they're so ubiquitous throughout the continent. Subtle, consistent messages of friendship, brotherhood, history, or cooperation reinforced through speeches celebrating the opening of a Confucius Center, or ads depicting African women dressed as Chinese ethnic minorities project carefully curated images of the PRC for African consumption. These images, whether depicting reality, history, or fantasy, have an important place within Africana studies as they help to shape the national imaginary of African communities. Yet Brand China, as I mentioned at the start, is also complicated by competing messages within both state, corporate, and individual depictions of Africa. The unresolved tension between Chinese popular discourse and official state accounts of Africa, its people, and its relationships to China creates brand confusion, thereby diminishing the strength and success of China's nation brand across the continent. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tara. And the final panelist is for this session is Yuan Wang, who is at Oxford. Her research is focused on China's economic and political development with Africa. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm honored to be here. My research is on the politicization for development, the politics of Sino-African railway cooperation. If we look at the data on the loans China provided to Africa's infrastructure, including transport, power, mining, ICT, and water, had received the most loans from China. And among them, if we look at just the red, the sectors within infrastructure, transport is the area where attracts most of Chinese loan interest. Then I am curious, are these Chinese interventions similar or different in different African states? So different from other panelists in this panel, I compared two Chinese projects in two African states. To answer this question, I picked the newly inaugurated Chinese-sponsored railways, one in Ethiopia and one in Kenya. So anyone who followed the news in the past year will never miss this massive media coverage of the Kenyan Standard Gauge Railway, which was launched in 30th of May 2017, and 7 months earlier, on 5th of October 2016, the Addis Ababa-Djibouti Railway was inaugurated in Addis Ababa. So the two railways actually has many similarities. Still this one. They are mega railway projects linking the capital city to the ports of Indian Ocean. They are also majorly financed by loans from China Exim Bank. And also both railways are constructed by Chinese state-owned enterprises, SOEs. These SOEs serve as, has dual identities of being the profit-making business and also the policy arms of Beijing. However, despite their similarities in physical structure, finance, and contractors, these two railways project very different trajectories. So first, in terms of the operation of the two lines, the passenger service of the Kenyan railway started the next day of the launch ceremony, while the operation of the Ethiopian railway was delayed for 1.5 years after the launch. Moreover, the two railways differ in their contributions to the domestic capitalist development. So the Kenyan railway will claim to have 40% local input, locally source their materials and people, staffs. Well, the Ethiopian railway locally sourced around 20 to 30%. And so the third one is that during the construction, the Chinese state-owned enterprises of the two projects have developed very different corporate social responsibility and public relations capacities. So there is an increase in both the number and the skill set of the employees in CRBC's relevant department. CRBC is the contractor of the Kenyan railway. And so the petite team of the Ethiopian railway contractor CREC's CSR and public relations remain stable in size, and they didn't demonstrate a steep learning curve at all. So here is my research puzzle. What explains these differences of the railways that are similar in nature? So why both of them are Chinese-sponsored, but still they develop into very different trajectories? This is a very empirical puzzle that bears theoretical significance. It speaks to the long-standing theoretical debate on the political institution and economic development in the third world, whether the neoliberal model or the developmental state model is more promotive to economic development. So the neoliberal theorists would argue that protection of property rights, the contract enforcement, and public accountability are important for economic development, while drawing on the East Asian newly industrialized states, and the developmentalists would argue that state autonomy, the linkage between public and private sectors, and Weberian bureaucracy as enablers for economic development. So this research will provide an alternative causal explanation to the neoliberalism and provide project-level evidence to this debate. So externally, contemporary debate on Chinese engagement in Africa echoes those debates on the dependency versus extroversion. So the dependency argument would argue that the development of Africa is primarily determined by external actors rather than the population of the African people, the population of African states. Moreover, African countries take a relative passive and in some way reactive role in their engagement with external actors, and African states are further locked into the dependent relationship with global capitalism by providing primary goods and lacking industrialization. In fact, the railways I'm studying are export-oriented, linking capital city to the port. So it actually fall right into the dependency argument, as some scholars would argue. But this dependency theory has been heavily criticized for those scholars advocating extroversion theory. So the extroversion theory says that Africa has been active agents historically and today in their relationship with the external world. And in fact, African elites has conceived of their economic links with the outside world as an integral part of their domestic power calculation. So in the rest of this presentation, I will show that dependency theory cannot explain the variation of the railways, and rather it is a primacy of the African domestic politics rather than the Chineseness that determines the trajectory of the railway projects. Oh, here it comes again. So I'll just continue. Engaging with these two theoretical debates, I propose the politicization for development theory. So the theory is developed through 4 steps. I will explain the 4 theoretical steps and then use empirical data collected from Kenya and Ethiopia to validate the theory. Yeah, here. So the first step. Under electoral uncertainty, the incumbent has higher vulnerability against opposition contestation. So in recent Kenyan very chaotic election event on the 8th of August 2017, actually the first election event, there were fierce competition between the incumbent Jubilee government under the leadership of Uhuru Kenyatta and the National Super Alliance NASA under the leadership of Raila Odinga. So in Kenya, there's like fierce competition between the incumbent and opposition. While in Ethiopia, it's under authoritarian rule of the EPRDF party, the EPRDF government Project Ethiopia as an African developmental state. And in the case of Ethiopia, where the excluded coalitions are quite weak, the ruling elites of the EPRDF are likely to feel less vulnerable. And second, the vulnerable incumbent would likely to politicize the project as their campaign capital for the election, where the project is dragged into the partisan contestation and is used to feed into the incumbent's constituencies. So in Kenya, the incumbent Jubilee government under Uhuru Kenyatta's leadership openly used the railway as Kenyatta's campaign capital to run for the 2017 presidential election. The opposition, on the contrary, have heavily criticized the project, especially with respect to the land acquisition and the contestation process, the high cost, and the corruption related to the project. Well, the authoritarian political context in Ethiopia does not allow the Ethiopian railway to be politicized. Unlike the Jubilee government in Kenya, EPRDF has less incentive to use a Chinese-supported project as political capital for regime survival. Instead, the EPRDF elites emphasize the prominence of the project to the national economic development and its symbolic meaning to the bilateral relationship with China. And sorry, it's stuck again. And third, if the project is politicized, The incumbent politician attached high commitment to the project and utilizing power and diplomatic means to lobby the Chinese companies and government to shape the outcome of the project to more timely completion, condensed local linkages, and sound sustainability. So since the onset of the construction work, Uhuru Kenyatta visited the standard gauge railway SGR construction sites on a quarterly basis. The president also established a ministerial committee consisting of 12 ministers. The Kenyatta's visit to the construction site is not ceremonial. In fact, during each site visit, Kenyatta held working meeting with the ministerial committee to listen to briefings regarding the construction process and challenges. So, and under the request of the president, CRBC, the Chinese contractor, completed SGR within 2.5 years and started the passenger service the very next day, which is 2 months before the August 8th presidential election. Comparatively, Kenyatta also requested the SGR to include at least 40% of local input. And when Premier Li Keqiang and Uhuru Kenyatta signed the contract of the railway deal in 2014, this 40% local input was highly publicized in Kenya in Kenyan media as a primary victory of the Kenyan side. Well, comparatively, since the beginning of the construction of the Addis-Djibouti Railway, Mr. Haile Mariam, the then Prime Minister of Ethiopia, visited the construction site only twice. And when I've interviewed the CREC, the Chinese contractor of the Ethiopian Railway, and Ethiopian Railway Corporation, they didn't mention anything regarding the Ethiopian side's promotion of like local inputs and hiring local people, stuff like that. Could you have? Yeah. So fourth, Chinese contractor actually, yeah, next one. Yes. And Chinese contractor actually also socialized with local social and political actors while working on the railway projects and developed various learning curves throughout the railway construction. More politicized railways develop higher, more steeper learning curves. The Chinese SOE in Kenya, CRBC, pressured by the constant derailing of the project by the opposition and the media, has cultivated a strong external relations department from 6 people at the beginning of the railway project to 10 full-time employees now. And they have, over the years, become very familiar with the rule of the games of the Kenyan media and have accumulated local media contacts, actively reaching out to them rather than remaining a closed-door attitude as many Chinese companies in Africa are accused of. CRBC also heavily invested in corporate social responsibility and have launched 2 CSR reports in 2015 and 2016 respectively, specifically on the SGR project. Well, in the Chinese SOE for Ethiopian Railway, CREC, there is one Chinese manager who is in charge of media relations. And when I visited the site in the summer of 2017, the PR manager was actually on maternity leave. So basically, no person was, when I visited, no person was in charge of CSR and PR relations, public relations. CREC's CSR strategy are very similar to those of the majority of the Chinese overseas construction companies, i.e., upon demand from the communities where their construction work take place, engaging activities such as digging a well, renovating local schools, and pave the village roads. The emphasis is less on transparency and publication of the CSR activity, brand building, but it's more on easing their relationship with local communities. So, can you press twice? Yes. So to conclude, my puzzle is why international sponsored projects that are similar in nature roll out very differently in different African states. My argument is twofold. The first is that it is the primacy of the African states, African domestic political dynamics, rather than the Chinese-ness that determine the trajectory of the projects. And second, the highly competitive and clientelistic political system in Kenya has resulted in a highly politicized railway project, and the political leadership attached very high commitment to this project. Whereas the developmental and authoritarian political system in Ethiopia does not leave much room for the politicization of the railway, and the railway project is placed not placed on the very top of the EPRDF government's agenda when there are so many other things ongoing. So even though both are funded and constructed by the Chinese, they're subject to the tremendous influence of political system of their domestic host, of their host countries. And thus the two railways developed into starkly different trajectories. Could you press again? Some theoretical contributions to this research. So regarding how African states engage with international actors, my research showed that dependency theory cannot explain the variance in the development of the African states. Rather, I find evidence to show that African elites actively engage with the external actors to shape the trajectory of the development of the railway project by lobbying the Chinese and the government. Moreover, regarding why do Africa remain underdeveloped despite decades of domestic aspiration and international support, this research poses challenge to the developmental states thesis and shows that contrary to the conventional wisdom of emphasizing state capacity, state autonomy, and centralized rent management, electoral competitiveness and project politicization can actually bring efficiency to the project implementation and development. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Yuan. I also want to thank all of the panelists for strictly abiding by the time requirement. We have about 25 minutes for questions from the audience. I would ask, as you raise your questions, to please give your name and affiliation. And if you have statements to make, please reserve those for the coffee break and the lunch break. We're interested in getting questions from you. Who would like to be the first individual? Please, right here in front. Please stand if you also.
Ken Meyercourt. One of the mistakes I think we've made in our foreign aid is providing the latest in high-tech equipment to very poor and underdeveloped countries, for instance, computers to people who don't even have electricity. The Kenya Railway, I don't know about the Ethiopian Railway, but the Kenyan Railway is a high-speed train, the latest in technology. Is China making the same mistake? Wouldn't a less advanced train be easier to maintain and less expensive? And was that an option?
Anyone in particular want to take that one on?
Yeah, okay. I think it probably, I will have to take it. Yes, in fact, comparatively, the Ethiopian railway is electrified, while the Kenyan railway is running on diesel. So the two railways. So when I talk with them, why Ethiopian side still want this very high, like the electrified, where their country is still in shortage, probably not as in electricity connection. So basically, the Kenyan, my very short argument is that the African states would request for it, and the Chinese provide for it. And then both the Kenyan side and the Ethiopian side were requesting for the electrified railway, while the Chinese engineers from the Kenyan side, from the SOE in Kenya, argued that, okay, your country cannot sustain the electrified railway, so you should run on diesel. And then the Kenyan side was very reluctant to accept that, but by the end of the day, they accepted it. So the African side always, probably sometimes would argue for more, would want more, but then it really depends on whether the providers, like the donors or the Chinese, could argue it down. I don't know if that answers your question.
Okay. Gentleman right here, please. Yes, you.
Young from Cornell University. Thank you for all the panelists. I have a brief question for both Christine and Haley. So in your research, you basically, in both research, you basically discussed that China does not pose a fundamental challenge to the current engagement between traditional donors and the African countries. So I want to push you further to the reason why we see this. Is China not? I think the distinction between capacity and motivation. Is China not powerful enough to do that? To pose a fundamental challenge, or does China see that coexisting with European powers is also in China's interest? So how to explain that? Thanks.
Who'd like to go first?
I can start off by just saying, for me, I think it's less about a competition, but rather that the engagement is just very different, right? And so that if I'm the argument around the change is based on the argument that because China offers an alternative, that African governments are then given more agency, and in that process of giving more agency, then they're able to negotiate better terms. So in my larger research project, I think African governments, also when engaging with traditional governments, have been under, the agency that they already have has already been underrepresented. So I'm not making an argument that African governments do not have agency. In fact, I think we typically underestimate how much agency they already have in these negotiations, but simply that that they're just engaging in very different ways. So Chinese assistance goes primarily to Chinese state-owned companies. Traditional assistance goes to recipient governments, goes through NGOs that are then working with sector ministries. It's because of looking differently, and it's less maybe about this power dynamic, but more simply that if I'm a government, I'm wanting both of those types of assistance. So that's where I'm coming from there.
Maybe I can add a bit on that from my research. I mean, what I find is not that China is not a challenge at all for the EU's governance support. I mean, I wouldn't say that, but I think when on the European side, there has been a lot of preoccupation that China actually undermines its governance support strategies. And what I find is that the EU is itself really not strategic in applying its governance instruments. So it's very difficult to then point at China and say that it's because of China that the EU is facing challenges, but the EU would need to take the domestic power dynamics much more into account. And in this regard, I think it's very interesting. I mean, I think we have quite a bit of complementarity on the panel in our different papers.
Who's next? Please, the lady right here. And there's a microphone coming. Right here. Okay.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Raquel Ledroyd from Human Rights Watch. My question is to Christine and maybe a little bit to Tara. Can you speak about the human rights impacts of Chinese engagement, particularly with the increased political and diplomatic ties that China is seeking to form? And then following up with the cooperation challenges that you mentioned with EU governance and democracy reforms, and then with the cultural repackaging and nation branding of sameness that Tara mentioned, how do you see this arena changing in the future?
Before you answer that, let me take one more question to add to this selection, please, right here.
Leo Zucker, Emerging Markets Forum. My question is for Dr. Ha Kodesh. You mentioned that the CCP has strengthened its ties to ruling parties in Africa in recent years. I'm curious if you could elaborate on how those ties work in more democratic countries, and particularly what happens when there is a change of government in such a country, and whether those ties survive or are damaged.
Christine, let's start with you and go down the panel.
Okay, I start with the last question on the CCP. What I found interesting is that, I mean, the CCP itself says that it has relations with ruling parties and opposition parties. But on the African continent, what I find is that the CCP almost has exclusively relations with the ruling party. And this is different from other regions. So it's different from Europe or from Australia or from the US. But what I also see is that when it engages with the ruling party and the ruling party changes, it's very pragmatic. So there is a change in cooperation. And this has been very interesting, for instance, in the case of Zambia, where China's engagement has been very much politicized in the election campaign, and there has been quite a close relation with the ruling party, and then the moment after the other party comes to power, there is a change. So this means that the CCP is quite strategic in its engagement and deciding who is its cooperation partners, and there is some difference, seems to be some difference in cooperation with African parties compared to other parties or other countries around the world. So I think a few issues to explore more later. And then the question on the human rights issues. What I do not look into my research is what is actually the impact of the EU or China on the governance situation as such. So does the human rights situation improve or not improve when the EU or China engages? So this is not part of my research. I mean, the countries I've been looking at, I think it's, I mean, you can really have a discussion on the EU's and China's engagement and their contribution. I mean, Ethiopia is a case where, I mean, Human Rights Watch has made very critical reports on the EU's, the United States, and other actors' contributions to actually not really improving the human rights situation. So I think one really needs to take a critical look at both sides' engagement, but I'm actually not, in my research, looking at the effect on the human rights situation in African countries.
Haley, do you want to add anything?
No, I think the question.
Yeah, sure. So to the first point regarding human rights, my research doesn't really cover those questions either very much, but regarding the cultural repackaging effect on development, I would say that it really depends on whom you ask. So I mentioned that the larger part of my project involved working within 3 different sites, the Gambia, Kenya, and South Africa. And what I discovered was that through a combination of awareness and exposure to the brand and competing messages, that the cultural repackaging, as you said, or these messages of sameness and similitude are more readily received within places like the Gambia, where there isn't necessarily a strong awareness. And so that calls into question sort of how the brand operates in a place where people have been fairly cloistered for a significant period of time. But with that said, it also was well received within Kenya, which is a place where there's been quite a bit of brand diffusion in terms of personal interaction and local media. But within South Africa, where there's more of a more pluralistic population, and there's also a longer, I mean, there's a more equitable relationship, I think, within that particular community. There's less of a tendency to accept that aspect of the brand itself.
Okay, we'll take 3 questions in a row here. Start way in the back of the room here, the gentleman, 2nd row from the back.
Thank you. I have my name is Isaac from the University of Alberta, Canada. I have a question for Kristen. So just some basic question. In your work, how are you defining African authoritarian regime? What does, for example, Kigali have in common with Ethiopia? What does I think you looked at Rwanda, Ethiopia, and Angola. And I'm wondering, I'm trying to see if you can elaborate on why you consider Rwanda as an authoritarian regime, much the same way as Ethiopia. And then the other question is for Tara. So could you clarify if there is a difference between how this cultural framing is done by the Chinese state as opposed to non-state actors, Chinese non-state actors that operate in Africa? And then secondly, given that we're going to be talking a lot about agency, African agency in this discussion, I'm wondering what is the, is there any kind of counter-narrative that emerges from the African context that pushes back on this sort of construction of sameness, or is it How is that playing out in terms of how is it received? And I think you mentioned it a little bit, but is there any other counter-narrative that also construct difference or sameness from the African side? Thank you.
And the gentleman right next door here.
Yes, thank you. Emmanuel Nyonsenga from African Great Lakes Action Network. And my question is more to Christine, where she's mentioned how there's African authoritarian regimes. Especially, I'm from Rwanda, and I concur with you saying that Rwanda is an authoritarian regime, and the fact that having individuals such as Bill Clinton, who have praised Kagame as a visionary leader, along with Tony Blair and Sherry Blair, who advocate greatly for Rwanda. My question is, do you think that these individuals are, let's say, hindering Europeans' efforts or the European Union's efforts in advancing its democratic processes? Thank you.
And the last question from this series, Larry over here on the far side of the room. Wait for the microphone, please.
Lawrence Freeman, I've been analyzing economic development in Africa for about 30 years. My question is to Yuan Wang, if I'm saying your name correctly. Did you look at the deeper implications of these railway developments in Ethiopia and Kenya? I happened to be I was there on October 5th when the line was open and took the inaugural ride. But if you look, did you look at the Chinese Ethiopians have a certain agreement? If you look at Meles Zenaway's writings, he attacked neoliberalism. He said the state has a role. China believes the state has a role in promoting economic development, that it shouldn't just be left up to the free market. We used to believe that in this country too in the early days of infrastructure. And the implications of these railway projects, because isn't it the case that these African countries want to industrialize and they need this infrastructure? And I don't know if you look that far, the Ethiopian line from Addis to Djibouti has several connections, and one of them is a highway to Hawassa, which is a major industrial center also built by the Chinese. So it's a whole plan of development that the leadership in Ethiopia, the Revolutionary People's Democratic Front, and the Chinese government have a similarity in their thinking about how to promote industrial development, which seems to me to be completely different from what we see from the United States and Europe. Thank you.
Let's start with Christine, and I will ask the panelists to be as succinct as possible. We have a lot of people who have questions yet, and we'll go down the aisle here. Please.
Okay. Thank you. I will take both Rwanda questions together. I mean, my research is anchored in this debate on authoritarian regime types, and I think that all three countries very nicely fit into this category of party-based authoritarian regimes, where there are elections, but these elections are not free and fair. And I think when we discuss about Rwanda, I mean, this is a country case that is often very controversially discussed. So you have people who see very positively the results that have been made and achievements that have been made in terms of poverty reduction and public goods provision. And then you have people who very much criticize the authoritarian nature of the regime. And I think when you look at the research on authoritarianism, you would very clearly find that these both dimensions, the success in poverty reduction and the reductions in political spaces, they both are two sides of the same coin. So it's part of the same regime, and it's a bit different. I mean, it makes the question is where you look at. And my impression is that, I mean, Rwanda, you mentioned Tony Blair and Clinton has received a lot of positive attention from a number of very high-level leaders. And this certainly has contributed to a positive view on the country that emphasizes more the poverty reduction compared to the limitations in political spaces. But my impression is also that there has recently been a bit of a change, of a shift in perception of the international community of Rwanda, particularly from the European side, where you see that challenges in terms of political liberties are seen much more critical now. But this change is relatively recently, and I would say that the positive view of international, known figures like Tony Blair have certainly contributed to the positive perspective on Rwanda and the emphasis on the poverty reduction compared to the difficulties in terms of elections, civil human rights, civil society organizations, etc.
Haley, do you wish to add anything?
Well, I might just say one thing on Rwanda, just because it's not something that I presented here, but I have been working on a project looking at donor engagement in Rwanda since 1994, and specifically looking at Dutch engagement in comparison to Canadian engagement, and talking about this question of whether or not there has been what's often labeled in the literature a genocide credit and how that's affected. And I think in some ways similar to the skepticism that I expressed here, we also express a bit of skepticism in the paper about how that's actually affected policies on the ground. So there's a lot of rhetoric, and this certainly changes some of the dynamics, but I think we also have to think about how has that actually changed the way policies and engagement, and I'd be more than happy to talk more with you and also have a conversation about that.
Tara.
Okay, so in response to your questions regarding the cultural message, so a large portion of the artifacts they used were actually developed by non-state actors. They were advertisements, and billboards, things I captured myself. So those were included within the analysis. But getting to your point regarding African agency, that was really the point of the project, was to really sort of critique this notion of African subjectivity in terms of its interaction with the external actors. And so in order to actually reach that point, it was necessary to first be able to definitively characterize brand China before I could actually look at how people on the continent responded. And so it wasn't a part of the presentation today, but the vast majority of the dissertation actually speaks to how people respond and what the counter-narrative is. I will mention that within the artifacts, I did look at artifacts that were similarly produced by leaders in Africa. And what I discovered was that their messages were very consistently aligned with those of the Chinese state. And so there was very little difference in that respect. But it may have something to do with the types of artifacts that I used and the way I selected them, because these were items that spoke specifically to this relationship. And so I think that in that respect, there can be some expectation that they're going to speak positively about it.
Yuan?
Yeah, so for this gentleman's question regarding whether states has a role in economic development, actually, I'm not aligning myself entirely with the neoliberalism. Actually, I'm presenting an alternative argument for them. So my emphasis is that because they're politically competitive in electoral competitiveness will actually lead to the commitment of the incumbent. So basically, the states actually has a role. But if there is not enough vulnerability of the incumbent, like in the case of Ethiopia and probably in Angola as well, the elite may not generate enough commitment to this specific project, and thus the project not developed as desirable as we would like them to be. And so embedded in this argument would be whether this specific project can be selected by the politicization process, i.e. why this specific project is selected. So embedded in my argument is that project that affects the livelihood, affects the voters' livelihood and interest would actually have a higher chance of being politicized in the process. And so, so unsatisfying in this high salience voter interest criteria will actually the railway project which actually promotes the economic development.
We'll take one final question. We had 15 minutes lopped off at the beginning of our session, so who would like to take a final question? Lady right here in front, please.
Thank you. Do you feel like Chinese contractors have preferences for whether their projects are politicized or not, both in terms of the short-term winning of the contract and building the project, and the long-term success of the project?
Yuan, did you want to deal with that one, or?
Okay, sure. So I asked them when I was interviewing them. Of course, when the Kenyan contractor is very happy that Uhuru Kenyatta is visiting them all the time, like 12 times over 2.5 years, and all the problems like land acquisition and compensation and technical obstacles are quickly solved. So their preference is that this specific, like the high-level visit with the commitment attached to the project is preferred. But the politicization also has a downside for the Chinese contractors, because it means that the opposition party will heavily derail the project, criticizing the project. That is a part that they don't want. In fact, even though their preferences is mixed, I find that the perceptions of the Chinese contractors differ in the two countries. In Kenya, the Chinese contractors perceive this project as a commercial project, while in Ethiopia, the Chinese contractors perceive it as a political project, as a government political task from Chinese and from Ethio-China friendship. So here is a very clear difference.
We are at the end of our time, 11 o'clock. We have about 1 minute left, actually, according to my watch. And if anyone on the panel would like to make any final parting statement, I will give them that 1 minute. If not, please thank all of the panelists.
And I'd like to thank Ambassador Shin and the panelists as well. We now have 15 minutes for coffee, but before we get up, just let me say, wasn't this a great way to start? Look at our panelists and our chair. Look at the audience. Think of all of that intellectual excitement that just came out from those 4 young women in our field. Yay.
I feel like a token here.